Good morning, Mr. Maleka. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Mr. Fuzile.
Good morning, Chairperson.
Thank you. I will not starting with the application that Ms. Norman sought to move yesterday.
Yes, Ms. Norman is not here, but Mr. Mokoena would be able to deal with the application.
Okay, shall we start with it?
He tells me that he's not ready. Yes, I hope it's not a poison pass.
Okay, all right. When should we deal with it then?
Chair, should we deal with them when Ms. Norman returns? She's coming around 12 o'clock, I'm told. There is a pressing matter that she had to attend to.
So the brief is with Mr. Mokoena now, but it will go back or what?
Chair, may I ask that we proceed with the evidence? And when Ms. Norman comes back, she should take the punishment she deserves for not being here on time to deal with that application.
Well, let's, I think you and I, let's continue with the evidence.
Yes.
Let's leave the head of the legal team to sort out this issue.
Yes.
As to when this application will be heard, yes, and whether it will be moved by Mr. Mokoena or by Ms. Norman.
Yes.
Let's get out of it for now.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry?
Sorry, just so that neither Mr. Mokoena nor Mr. Maleka are visited with any approbation on your part for the present state of affairs. I received a telephone call from Ms. Norman this morning who said that she would not be here today. She's attending a function in Pretoria, but would be back as soon as that function was over. So we were visited as a legal team with a fait accompli in that regard, and we apologize for any inconvenience.
Yeah, the problem is that I said yesterday we would deal with this application this morning. That's what I said, and if she was not going to be here, she should have made sure there is somebody who is ready to deal with it, yes, or to ask that it be stood down or something.
Yes, she did suggest that the application be dealt with by others, but Chair, adequate notice is probably required before the application can be given justice, so that the papers can be got through and preparation and notes made for the address.
I'll put it aside for now, and I assume somebody will talk to me in due course as to when it should be dealt with.
I'll deal with it in a short adjournment.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Mr. Maleka.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Mr. Fuzile, yesterday we ended up on the events of the 9th of December, and we're going to resume with the events of the 10th of December. And you begin by describing those events from paragraph 20 on page 58 of your statement, which is in Exhibit P. Do you still have it before you?
I must confess I don't have it, and I didn't take it home. I left it here.
Yes. It must be in one of those bundles. I'll ask my colleagues to...
it's not hard for me to...
Oh.
If it's here, I will find it. I think it was P1, P.
P.
Yes.
Well, you may as well, Mr. Fuzile, bring the others closer in case they are needed in the course of your evidence. I think somebody wanted the place to look organized. Thank you.
Can you just flip over to page 58?
I am in the broader economy of South Africa that do the same at different intervals and magnitudes relative to government. And of course, on any given day, the ability to get that money depends on the perception of risk by investors or lenders. And if they think that the currency is gonna fall precipitously over a given period of time, then it stands to reason for them to expect that a rand, a dollar that they invest in SA today would be worth less a week later if the currency has weakened. And therefore they would hesitate to engage in an action that destroys value like that. Small movements of the currency do not normally bother investors, but sharp movements do concern them. And this is applicable not only to bond investors, by the way, it is also applicable to investors in equities, and of course in greenfields projects, because whilst in one sense it makes it cheap to invest in SA, but the concern an investor has is, when I repatriate that investment out of South Africa, will it be worth more or less? And if they think that it will be worth less, they may not be prepared to take that risk.
All right. So it would be fair to sum up that your concern regarding the poor performance of our currency at the time related to the investor confidence in our currency, and also the burdensome effect of it on our liability that is denominated in foreign currency when we borrow in the financial market.
That is very true, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Now, Minister Gordon gave the chairperson some numbers relating to the performance of our currency at that time. Chair, you would recall that he did so with reference to Exhibit N1, especially on page 30 and paragraph 79 of his statement. and also with reference to Exhibit N2 on page 140, which are the figures that he ultimately sourced from Bloomberg indices. Mr. Fuzile, I'd like you to confirm, if you could please, those numbers as the precise indicators of the rand's performance during the reference period that Mr. Godin talked about. There is a bundle before you which must be marked N2.
Yes, I have it.
Can you go to page 140 of that bundle?
I'm starting to wonder if I've got the same N2 as you, because my N2 started 425.
No, that's N1B that you have. There should be a file which is N2. Can I ask one of my colleagues to assist you?
Well, we will need him to know which bundle is what for purposes in case later on he is referred to another bundle. So
Indeed.
we will need him to know which bundle is what and where it is so that he can find it with ease.
Yes.
Maybe for this purpose, I should just take a 2 minutes, 3 minutes adjournment and let somebody check that he has got everything
Yes.
that he needs to have.
Chair, I'll be grateful if we could do that.
Yes.
And can we also use that moment or that opportunity to indicate to you that there are additional documents that we requested the legal team of Mr. Fuzile to bring here,
You said M2, is that the supplementary?
The supplementary bundle of Mr. Godan.
The writing on its spine
Yes.
is smaller
Yes.
compared to the writing on the spines of the other Livart files.
Yes.
So to identify it is quite a problem if you are looking for N.
Yes.
So I think given the tea break or lunch break, if somebody can put a bigger, something with a bigger writing,
Yes.
so I can see it from a distance. The others are not so bad. I think
Yes.
it's bigger. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We will attend to that during the tea adjournment.
Yes. And you said it's page
140.
140.
Yes, Chair.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Are you there, Mr. Fuzile?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairperson.
I'm not going to take you through the details. I just wanted to confirm, or let me say this. Mr. Godan has gone through the details and has confirmed them under oath. So I'm not going to go through that repetitive exercise. But what I want you to confirm is that those numbers reflect the performance of the rand as against the dollar from the 9th of December up to Friday, the 11th of December 2015. Do you see that? And the closing was 15 rand 90 cents as against the dollar on the 11th of December 2015. So that's the 2 days of the trading period. My calculation is that for that 2 short days, the rand lost approximately $1.31 as against the dollar.
Yes, 1 rand 39 cents, yes.
Yes. And what is the significance of that movement in that amount?
The significance of that, if you were to just consider an individual who was in the process of buying something from a place that uses the dollar, for instance. And most countries, by the way, you go via the dollar when you enter in these international transactions. It means that within that very short space of time, the person would have had to pay for every dollar that they bought with the rand as much as that difference between 1459 and 1590, more. Now, it might look like it's a small amount, perhaps, it's 1 rand 39, but if you are engaging in a transaction of $1 billion or multiples of billions of rands, then all of a sudden the picture becomes very different.
Yes.
It's not inconceivable, for an example, that there may be people, those who trade in commodities, who would have had to buy or pay for oil or something of that sort for those amounts. Of course, there are other things that people do to protect themselves against that, but if you just take the spot rate,
Yes.
That is the implication.
Yes. I mean, for our part, you have indicated that for a week you used to borrow about $9 billion.
Rands.
So 9 billion rands. So for that week you will be paying 1 rand 31 cent more because of the performance of the currency. As I have it.
The arithmetic would work differently, Mr. Chair. Yeah. But let's just apply it differently. That is the quality. If you, for instance, take $1 billion worth of our debt,
Yes.
right? Just without doing anything, if you were to revalue it between those 2 days, that $1 billion debt would now have had to increase by the multiple of the difference between those two amounts.
Yes.
Am I making sense? So in other words, when you convert it to rands, it's no longer now the $1 billion times 1459.
Yes.
It is the billion rand times 1590. Yes. You have not borrowed more, but all of a sudden, the amount of debt that you owe
Increases.
has increased.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Now, in paragraph 21, you talk about the meeting you had with Minister Nene at his office. And yesterday, I asked you some questions. I'm going to skip it unless you want to comment on it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Then we go to paragraph 23. I'm going to skip paragraph 22. Unless you want to confirm it. But
it will become important just for reflection, because I can now recall that the first thing I did as contact with Mr. Van Rooyen was to send him an SMS.
yes.
Exactly at what time of the evening of his announcement as the new Minister of Finance, I can't remember. I congratulated him. And then in 22, as I say, when that call took place, I congratulated him again. In a way, I reached out. You could say, demonstrated acceptance of the fact that he had been made minister.
Yes.
I didn't have to choose my bosses. Of course, I could choose jobs. But so there I was,
Yes.
reaching out.
Yes.
And it will become important later on.
Yes.
Just this point.
But by the time you send the SMS and by the time you called him on the morning of the 10th of December, he was known to you. He was no stranger to you. He was someone that you knew.
Yes.
And you confirm, in fact, in paragraph 24 that you had worked with him and appeared before him in Parliament because he was a member of the Parliamentary Finance Committee, correct?
That is correct.
So he was no stranger to you, someone that you knew and had worked with.
No, he was no stranger to me. I had his telephone number, which is why I could send him an SMS. I didn't have to look for it. And he had my telephone number because we had had exchanges previously on matters that, in fact, he himself needed, which related to his work,
Yes.
proper stuff.
Yes. And in paragraph 22.1 and 22.2, you explain why you called him. Can I ask you to elaborate on those considerations?
Yes, I did that. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'm on 22.1 as Mr. Malek is leading me on page 59 where my statement is. I said that the first thing that I had in mind was to ask him to try and get to the department early that morning, because I was aware from the previous night that Minister Nene was going to be in the department early that morning. He would be packing his belongings to clear the office so that his successor could occupy it. And of course, because it was not the first time that we had a change of minister, as Mr. Chairman might recall, we had the change from Minister Manuel to Minister Gordon after the elections of 2009. And we did a very nice, seamless change from a minister who had been with the department for 13 years to the new one who was coming, who, by the way, was no stranger to us because he had been the commissioner of SARS. We could have said there is no need for introductions because everyone knew him. But we just thought because of the people tend to develop real chemistry with their bosses, it would be just a good thing also to just have this thing of showing that the one minister is leaving, this is Manuel in the first instance, and the new one is coming, there's no problem, life continues. So I wanted us to do more or less a similar thing with the outgoing minister, Minister Nene, and at the time of my call, Minister-designate, Mr. Des van Rooyen. I also wanted to do this in his case, in particular, because his appointment had come, even though there had been rumors, unexpectedly, and I anticipated, in fact not anticipated, I already knew from SMSs and just other communication that people had been unnerved by the development. And I thought that symbolically having the two of them, one saying his goodbyes and the other one saying I'm here, and whatever other good stuff they would have said to try and calm the people would have been valuable.
Sorry, go ahead.
The second reason was that I also asked him to consider issuing a media statement in light of what I was seeing insofar as the currency is concerned, which we talked about, which was a serious and if you will, precipitous fall in the currency, and of course all the implications that that had for the country. Wanted us to consider drafting a carefully worded statement which he would issue, which would in the main respond very directly to some of the issues that concerned the people. But of course, as it will become apparent later, he turned that down.
Yes. I understand the soft issues of the outgoing minister meeting with the incoming one and the exchange pleasantries and so on, but there are hard issues relating to any changeover and transition.
That's it.
And those, amongst others, and if you are now in private sector, you know that one of the best practices is handover.
Exactly.
What is the process in National Treasury when there is this shift in ministries?
When it happens at a time of elections, we spend a lot of time to set out in detail, first just the broad work of the Treasury. I suspect that some of what was referred to here as a document that Minister Manuel had prepared was part of that file which Minister Manuel had prepared for his likely successor.
Yes.
He did that every time when the elections came, needless to say, he would return and have to read it himself. Until, of course, Minister Gordon came. So we had this practice of having that, you can call it an induction file.
Yes.
We would identify the major projects that the department would be working on at any given time so that the minister has got this document that he can go to, which he receives from his predecessor. Of course, it may not be easy to do this as perfectly as I've described it now when the change happens in between.
Yes.
But be that as it may, as you are correctly indicating, Mr. Maleka, there is a need for it, that the outgoing minister and the new one must meet and interact so that even if the outgoing minister does not hand a fresh file, maybe hands over the old one and then signals the changes that have happened since they were in office, and of course they can agree that at time T plus whatever, they will meet again where they can do a proper handover.
Indeed. You must know what's in the in-tray, which would include the pressing and priority issues. But anyway, did that handover take place when the changeover happened between Minister van Rooyen and outgoing Minister Nene?
It never did, to my knowledge.
Why did that not happen?
Because when I asked Mr. van Rooyen to come, he said he would come at his own time.
All right. In paragraph 23, you explain the response of Minister van Rooyen to the two suggestions you had made in the course of the telephone conversation you had with him. And you described that response as turning down your suggestions, but then telling you, and I quote you, sternly, that the officials of National Treasury have a tendency to issue statement or statements, and that must come to an end. Do you confirm that that was his unmistakable response to your suggestions?
That is exactly what happened.
Yes. And
Was this the first occasion you were speaking to him after his appointment?
Interacting, Mr. Chairman, but I had sent him an email the night before.
No, I mean in terms of, were you not speaking to him now?
Yes, it was the first time of speaking to him, and it's probably just about 12, 13 hours after his appointment had been announced.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. I'm struck by your use of the adverb sternly. I mean, I went to the dictionary to look at what it means, but in your words, what does it convey?
I mean, in this context, I would even say it conveys excessive preoccupation with authority. It was as though maybe we, as the officials, were behaving in a manner that he felt required to be put to an end, or a stop had to be put to it. As I go on to say, it just struck me as being prejudicial, I mean, full of prejudice, because I just couldn't understand, given the processes that we used to go through as a department before a statement would be put out. Because even in this case, I wasn't saying we are going to issue a statement. I was saying to him, I think you should consider issuing a statement.
Yes.
And if you are okay with that, then we can start to draft something, which of course, in the normal course of doing our business, he would have had to He would have had to say, I'm happy with it. And if in the normal course of doing business, he wished to discuss it with us, to understand deeply why we were using the words we were using in certain parts, why we felt it necessary to say the things we would have been proposing he should say, then we'll do it. That's what we used to do with all his predecessors, who, by the way, I can say here, not because I don't want anything from them, they are no longer my bosses. What I know of them, they would have been able to draft a statement that would deal with the kinds of concerns that were there sufficiently without deferring to us. But just the teamwork culture that had been inculcated in the Treasury and the appreciation of the power of teamwork was such that everyone would be pulled in, relevant people, of course, to make a contribution to thinking about how to carefully word, nuance a statement that would achieve the purpose for which it is intended. So I was astounded by the reaction.
Yes. And in fact, that's what you say in paragraph 14. And you indicate there that your immediate view of things from his response was that you thought he was prejudiced about or against members of Treasury. Do you confirm that?
Yes, I confirm it.
Chair, that response of Minister van Rooyen and the rebuke is going to become important when we deal with Mr. Fuzile's evidence about the attitude taken by his advisors. Because as you know from the reading of the statement, the advisors took a different view. They wanted the statement when he did not want it. Yes, but we'll get to that point in due course. Now, Mr. Fuzile, I would skip the rest of paragraph 24 because you have dealt with it. You have indicated to us the context in which you had prior knowledge and prior working relationship with Minister van Rooyen. And now I turn to page 60, and I'm at paragraph 25. And you say there that you were disappointed by the attitude taken by your minister designate at the time. And you say you were disappointed. Why were you disappointed?
I was disappointed, Mr. Chairman, because one, he was breaking tradition. And two, I really thought that it would make for a good start for him to be seen with his predecessor addressing stuff, and also just to hear his predecessor. And of course take some sense of the mood of the department he was then soon to be charged with leading, which then would have, of course, informed how he would approach his work going forward. I was also disappointed because insofar as, for instance, the statement was concerned, there was a lot of speculation about what had led to the removal of Mr. Nene, his appointment, Mr. van Rooyen, and what it would imply for first the institution of the Treasury and how it would approach its work from then on. Yes. So I was hoping that he would use the opportunity quite quickly to dispel some of those notions. Yes. Of course, he could have come out and said different things. That too would have helped because it would have meant that both the department and the rest of the country and the world would have known where he stood. But it was just important, in my view, for him very early on to come and do that stuff. I was also disappointed because it just seemed, which is what I get to in 26, that at that time, he hadn't come to terms with what his role was about. It just seemed to me from the reaction that he was oblivious to the fact that the currency was, for instance, depreciating in the manner in which it was doing, and that he had a role in doing something to stave that off. Of course, he could have worked with others and so on and so forth. But it was important because the questions that people were asking, the speculation was a lot around him, and only Mr. van Rooyen was in a position to dispel some of that speculation.
Yes. I mean, you come across as someone who's explaining a moment of crisis which required intervention by the leadership of Treasury, and you indicate that the leadership at the time was the incoming minister, who you required him to do something. Now, can I ask you this? In the absence of a leadership intervention from the head of Treasury, which you identified as the minister, who else would be able to play that role? Who else will come and assure the markets and assure the country that it is not as bad as the market may reflect in terms of the performance of the currency?
I think it would be correct to expect that it would be the president or the presidency.
Yes. Chair,
and in this case, there was a statement issued by the presidency. In fact, I suspect a few of them in one day.
Yes. Mr. Mahajanu would explain how the presidency, in conjunction with Treasury, filled the void which was taking place at the time. And then you conclude that part of your disappointment by indicating in paragraph 27 that you may have expressed your disappointment to some of your colleagues. As you sit here today, are you able to indicate who those colleagues could be?
I am sure, as I indicated in the statement, that Ms. Makanda, who was the head of communication, knows about this. In fact, at one stage, I recall that she was with me and, when I was talking to Mr. Van Rooyen, and I put the phone on speaker so that she would hear, because I had anticipated that, in fact, the call was going to be to switch quickly from the suggestion I was making to actioning it, which is to say, maybe we should draft a statement, we should say ABC to it, and then she was going to get started with that, and of course, I and other colleagues would have had to just take a look at it and make inputs, ultimately have the minister approve it and release it later on after he's sworn in.
Yes.
Just as a matter of interest, the swearing in, his swearing in, was to happen later in the day, isn't it?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me. And I think I must have seen something to the effect that it happened around midday or thereabouts. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Would a minister designate, as you have said, would a minister designate be able to perform any duties of minister before he or she is sworn in?
No, not really, and it's a good question you're asking, Chairman. I should have maybe clarified this. The idea was not to say to him, come and consider issuing a statement right now. We anticipated that after he's sworn in, there would be media people, because we had done the thing before. And we knew that the media would be asking him the questions that were in fact floating. And our preference was that he should read a statement. And in fact, not only were we going to have him read a statement, if he wished, which is something we used to do diligently, is to anticipate the questions that might be asked. And we do a question and answer document for him, so that the idea with these things, it's not about the individual. It's about saying you want to preserve the institution, the office of the Minister of Finance, Head of Treasury, and the Treasury, and South Africa. So what we were thinking about essentially, not just me, including my colleagues, was we now have Minister Van Rooyen. We may not have been expecting it, but now let's see if we can make it work. Yes. Let's see if we can help him project a picture as good as his predecessor or predecessors first time. But of course, he turned down the opportunity.
Yes. I mean,
so what you had in mind was that if, when you spoke to him in the morning on the 10th and made this suggestion, if he was in favor of the suggestion, possible the work of drafting the statement could start even before the swearing in, and it would be ready by the time he was sworn in, and he could he could use it immediately after the swearing in ceremony to dispel any perceptions.
Precisely, Mr. Chairman, including familiarizing himself with the statement, because you need that lead time.
Yes.
It's one thing to read a statement that has just been passed to you, and once you have folded it and put it aside, people ask you questions about it, and some of them, they can just even pick a word. They say, exactly why have you chosen to use this word? And if you have not internalized it yourself, you could come out badly. So the idea was, let him prepare so that by the time he needs to issue a statement, he has it. by the time he needs to respond to questions from the people from the media, he is able to respond to them coherently and convincingly, which is something we all do or used to do, and I'm sure it continues to this day. I used to joke to people that when I would be asking my direct reports, some of whom are here, I say, look, this time you have to go and say the things that you normally ask me to go and say. You say them yourself, which was true, because I wasn't producing all of the stuff that came out of the Treasury. It was produced by the team under me, with me. I just happened to occupy a particular position where I was the face of the department at a particular level below the minister.
So, ideally, in terms of what you had wished for, what you had wished for would probably have been something like that he might have had a meeting with you, either alone or with such other members of your team as you might have wished to put together. You might have had a session with him, and that opportunity could have been used for him to just make sure that his understanding of the issues that were quite important for the day was the same as yours, as the team's, and then how this should be handled in terms of any media conference later in the day.
That is I was wishing for, Mr. Chairman, and there was a method in how I was thinking about it. Was had he come at the time when he was going to be talking to Mr. Nene, he would even have had the opportunity, let's say potentially, to just hear from Mr. Because Mr. Nene had been a deputy minister for 6 years before he became minister. And during part of that time, if my memory serves me well, there had been a turmoil of sorts, and we dealt with those, including, for instance, even having the SAB work with us to issue a statement just to reassure the market and stuff. So that's what I had in mind.
Yes.
Thank you.
And of course, the foundational point you make is not that you were trying to follow the tradition and processes for the sake of it, but you're doing so in order to protect the institution of Treasury. People come and go, and institutions are perennial, and they have to survive strongly or weakly as it may be. Now, the next chapter that you deal with of that morning, of the 10th of December, is the swearing in, and I'd like you to move quite quickly. The chairperson has asked you some issues around it. But the first issue you reference in regard to that part of the morning is that you were invited to attend the swearing in of Minister van Rooyen, and there is nothing eventful about paragraph 28 in relation to that invitation. Unless you want to tell us who invited you.
It's a pity because I don't remember the person's name. I even suspect that I never bothered to ask the person's name.
All right. But we know that the venue that you reference as the place for the ceremony of swearing in chairperson is at that time the Union Building, correct?
That's correct.
And the first event you identify about that venue is that the first person you met is some person who introduced himself as Mr. Mohammed Bobat, correct?
That is correct.
We were not there, and some of us may not be in the hallowed place of the Union Building. Can you give us a sense of the setting, how you met him, how the introduction took place, and who said to who?
Thank you very much. I got there, Mr. Chairman, I think it was after 11. And of course, I'm walking on this kind of very long, I would call it a veranda for simplicity. And there was a person standing right in front of the door, which I knew was the place I had been directed to go to. Of course, I didn't know the person. So as I got quite close, within earshot, he looks towards me And he greets me. Good morning or good day, Mr. Fuzile. I responded. And then he told me immediately that, in fact, as part of introducing himself, that he is the advisor to Mr. Van Rooyen. And I was taken aback. I was taken aback because all the advisors the department had had during my tenure, which were not many, had signed contracts with me. Perhaps to use the context of here, it's like you meeting a person who is your subordinate that you're supposed to appoint, maybe leave the subordinate part because it is inaccurate. A person on whose appointment you are supposed to be the signatory, and you know you have not signed any piece of paper, and the person tells you that I am employed here. Essentially, that's what it meant. Yeah. That was the first astonishing thing. The second astonishing thing was the fact that...
Before the second, is it astonishment or what? Before the second one, why were you taken aback because Mr. Kotongwana told you the previous day?
It's good you say that.
He will come to it if you don't mind. Can I, with your leave, my apologies. He's going to talk to that issue fairly soon. Can I ask you, with your permission, to ask him to conclude the first part? Because the second part is coming, and you will see that it is in paragraph 30.2 on page 61.
All right.
And with your leave, Chair.
Right.
Yes. So in a way, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Malek, whilst theoretically a minister can just bring anyone to be their advisor, so they've got discretion. It helps if they get a good person, I might add. But, and I do touch on that. But as I say, I was the only person with the authority. I could delegate it to someone if, for instance, I'm traveling. But usually at the Treasury appointments, we would do the delegation under exceptional circumstances, precisely to avoid this situation where a person gets appointed by a person in in an acting capacity or for a day, because if it happens to be a wrong person, the process to remove the person can be cumbersome. Yes. So I hadn't signed any papers for him. There he was telling me he is the advisor. He was not saying, I'm going to be the advisor to Mr. Van Rooyen, which I perhaps would have kind of reluctantly brushed aside. He was saying strongly, I'm the advisor at the time.
Yes, and I'd like you to deal with the second element of your surprise by reading paragraph 30.2 on page 61.
So the second element of my surprise gets to the point then that yesterday we did touch on, which was that all of a sudden what I heard, and if you will, kind of partially believed, but I didn't dismiss it, but I sort of hazily kind of said it can be that a person would be given advice and stuff like that. So it turned out that when I saw this guy, and you would remember that I said that the point that almost got me into trouble yesterday, which is I was hesitating to just talk about his race. But there he was, and he happened to look to be of Indian descent. So I said, so obviously there must be truth in everything that Mr. Kotongwana had said the previous evening. I mean, I was really surprised, perturbed.
How soon after meeting him and hearing him saying he's the advisor to the new minister, how soon did you realize that it meant that Mr. Kotongwana was right? Was it something that happened
Immediately.
soon? Immediately.
Immediately. Because perhaps let me just make this point. I mean, I know Mr. Kotongwana quite well. He's a serious person. He can even say serious stuff, you know, with a chuckle, but he's a very serious person. And a lot of the time, when we talk, it's clear when we're joking, it's clear when we're serious. I had understood him to be serious, but it was like a fairy tale that, I mean, just the story as I told it yesterday. But now when this point happened, this was the real first point where this connecting of the dots was occurring, because here was a person standing in front of me, and here was a person, by the way, who almost disdainfully tells me, as the accounting officer, who is supposed to sign a contract with him on behalf of the government, he is telling me that I'm working for government. Yes. Later we might talk about the importance of a contract, and talking to lawyers, I'm sure you would understand.
Yes, we will get there. But for now, we went to bed the previous night with this shocking prediction by Mr. Gondongwana, and the next morning, that nightmare is now unfolding in reality before you when you meet the person who says things that, in your view, are not consistent with your functions and duties. And in paragraph 30, you make the point that you were surprised that by that stage you had met Mr. Bobat. The minister designate had just been announced about 15 to 17 hours, and yet he had an advisor already. And you say that you had never seen something like this in 2 decades that you have been in the public service. Is that correct?
Yes, in nearly 2 decades. I hadn't seen it.
Was this the first of its kind that you had to confront on that day?
I mean, essentially, it was the first of its kind. The minister hadn't been to the department, but he had already figured out, if you want to be charitable, that he would need an advisor. What gap was the advisor filling?
Yes.
What need was he filling?
Yes.
Because the minister hadn't been to the department. He hadn't spoken, to my knowledge, to anyone in the department, not Minister Nene, certainly not me, but he had already determined he would need an advisor.
You may or may not be able to say this, but based on what I know you say in your statement, it's unlikely that you are likely to say it's unlikely that they knew each other well. That is Minister van Rooyen and Mr. Is the correct pronunciation Bobat or Bobat? Do you know?
I don't know.
I just want to pronounce it correctly.
But I think I'm pronouncing it correctly when I say it's Mr. Bobat.
Oh, okay. All right. Do you know whether he might have been an advisor that Minister van Rooyen might have had at some stage in the past? Well, I don't know if you are in a portfolio committee, a member of parliament. I doubt that you would have an advisor. Is it somebody that he may have been using when he was occupying some position before?
Factually, Mr. Chairman, I don't know. But what I can say is that committees in Parliament would have researchers. And the committee he happened to be in, I knew reasonably well. And I knew the researchers for that committee. And Mr. Bobat was not one of them.
So, so the appointment had been announced at some stage in the evening the previous day. Was it around about, did you say yesterday it was around about 8 p.m.?
Yes.
And you were now meeting Mr. Bobat around midday on the 10th.
Yes.
So he would have been up, I don't know whether appointed is the correct word, since you had not signed any papers, but he would have been told by whoever told him that he was going to be Mr. van Rooyen's advisor. He would have been told either in the evening or that morning, the morning of the 10th, within 24 hours after the announcement, actually within much less than that.
15 to 17 hours.
Within about 17 hours, he was already, for all intents and purposes, as far as he was concerned, in the job.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. But of course, it would be remiss of me to just leave that point like that, because as I indicated yesterday, the process of approaching a person for the possibility of becoming a minister could start a day earlier. It's not inconceivable that it could start much longer before the person is announced. We don't know that part. But of course, be that as it may, it can never detract from the fact that if I am given a role and I have the option of asking to have an advisor, the first thing I think about is to have an advisor rather than, and of course, determine that the right advisor is this one before I have landed in the department and made a proper assessment that this department has got economists, it has got accountants, it has got financial analysts, but it lacks this part. So to complement my capacity, let me get an advisor to perform this role. Of course, that is my way of thinking about it. I don't know if political principals think about it this way. They may be using a different process altogether.
Yes. Well, they will appear before the chairperson, and they'll have to explain themselves about the way they think when they go through these processes. And in paragraph 13, you say that Mr. Bobat wasted no time. And he started to issue instructions to you. Do you confirm that?
Yes, I can confirm it.
What did he say to you?
He said to me, if I quote him verbatim, I would require a statement from you to be issued by the minister, unquote.
Do you confirm that those are his instructions to you as far as you can recall?
Yes. And it is not inconceivable that Ms. Makanda, who was close by, might have heard this, but I am not sure. I've never cared to test with her whether she did hear.
Here's the thing. I mean, you tried to get Minister-designate Van Rooyen earlier on to consider preparing a statement that he would issue once the formalities have been done. And he rebuked you for that suggestion. And yet, when moments later you meet a person who describes himself as the advisor, he requires you, by way of an instructions, to prepare that statement. The two, as far as I see, cannot sit side by side. Why would there be any inconsistency of that sort from your perspective between a minister-designate at the time and his supposed advisor at the time?
But the sharpest way to put this is, it was clear then that Mr. Bobat hadn't cared to check with his principal what he would want to do and how. I mean, it's obvious. It is here for everyone to see it. Because it just so happened that the first instruction he issues to me, unfortunately for the guy, it's in direct contravention with what the person on whose behalf he was purporting to be acting had indicated. I make the offer that we should consider issuing a statement. He puts me down quite sternly, and moments later, the person who's the advisor, who is supposed to help the minister, not the other way around, feels that he should demand a statement from me. We will come, of course, to the other issue, which is exceedingly important, as far as I'm concerned, and is a learning point for everyone in the nation. Advisors don't issue instructions to DGs and any official for that.
Well, I was about to ask whether it is normal for a minister's advisor to issue an instruction to Director General.
It is abnormal, Mr. Chairman, but let me apologize for even hinting at it. I'm sure Mr. Maleka is coming because it is part of the statement.
Yeah, no, but you can
it is
answer
abnormal.
for now. Yeah.
It is abnormal.
Yes, yes.
It is illegal. In
Yeah.
fact,
Yes.
let me put it straightforwardly.
Yes.
It is illegal.
But of course, you speak about, you suggest that it seems that Mr. Bobat didn't care to speak to his principal about the issue of a statement, because if he had, maybe he would have known that his principal was against the idea. But also it seems that when the principal had to respond to your suggestion in the morning, he too didn't check with his advisor what he thought about this idea.
I cannot agree with you more.
Chair, just before we take the tea adjournment, can I ask Mr. Fuzile to round up his view of the instructions by Mr. Bobat and the conclusions that he drew from the attempts to issue instructions?
Yeah.
And you make some conclusions from paragraph 34.1. May I ask you and invite you to reflect those conclusions as accurately as we can by reading into the record those subparagraphs?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. 34.1. Mr. Bobat did not care about, it became clear to me, given just how he conducted himself, that he did not care about protocol or civilities. And he appeared determined to assert his authority over me. He was not bothered that he was not an employee of the department at that time, and that his role had never been explained to me by anyone else other than him, or other than himself. 34.2, Mr. Bobat felt such a sense of authority and empowerment that he could issue instructions to anyone without first checking with the person that is the minister designate on whose behalf he purported to act. He gave me an impression of being a law unto himself. Lastly, 34.3, as it happened on that occasion, which was your point, Mr. Chairman, he issued an instruction that was the direct opposite of what the minister, his principal, wanted. And I state this as a matter of fact because the minister designate had indicated to me earlier that he did not want a statement from me or us as the officials of the department.
He had actually, from what you have said already before, the minister had actually indicated to you that you people at Treasury must stop this tendency of yours of issuing statements, so which seemed to indicate they didn't like media statements.
Certainly the ones prepared by us.
Yes. Well, Chair, Mr. Fuzile, I had to be in your position at that time because two persons are setting authority over you, trying to put you in a situation where you don't understand truly what their instructions to you are. Chair, is this a convenient moment to take the tea adjournment?
Yes, we'll take the short adjournment and resume at 25 to 12.
Thank you, Chair.
We adjourn.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Malaga.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Fuzile, you, in paragraph 35, you talk about a further instruction which Mr. Bobat issued to Ms. Makanda in your presence. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman.
In paragraph 36, you indicate that instructions reflected his failure to understand the communication policy and protocol of National Treasury at the time. Correct?
That is correct.
Ms. Makanda will elaborate on these things, but for your purposes, you can confirm that National Treasury had its own communication policy.
Yes,
And
that is
that
correct.
you, as the head of National Treasury at the time, authorized that policy in terms of public service regulations.
Yes, that is correct.
And in paragraph 37, you indicate that at some point as the flow of instructions was taking place from Mr. Bobat, Minister Van Rooyen arrived. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Can I ask you to tell us, because we were not there, what happened when he arrived at the time you were with Mr. Bobat and others?
Mr. Van Rooyen, on arriving at the Union Buildings, he and Mr. Bobat greeted, and I could sort of pick that amongst the things they were discussing was the fact that Mr. Bobat had tried to call Mr. Van Rooyen earlier, and Mr. Van Rooyen hadn't answered the call. And of course, it was obvious that there was a bit of agitation in Mr. Bobat, but quite importantly, I picked the comment from Ms. Van Rooyen to the effect that he didn't recognize the number, which would suggest that it's not a number that would appear with a person's name that's saved on the phone. So, and because he was appointed, probably, knowing myself from the time I would get appointed, you get too many calls from people you know, and you can identify the names, and sometimes from people you know who are calling you from new phones, but also people you don't necessarily know, and therefore you don't have their phone numbers on your phone. So I could pick that, which would suggest to me that either they didn't know each other or they hadn't known each other for too long to have exchanged telephone numbers before that time.
Well, can I try and press for some?
The body language wasn't great, actually, because I had been used to seeing advisors who would approach the ministers with a lot of deference, as their bosses, essentially. And the just degree of, you can call it agitation and stuff, and the tone to a certain degree of Mr.
On the
Bobat.
first day of being advisor to the minister.
The first hours of being advisor to minister designate, to be precise, advisor without a contract for that matter.
Yes.
So there was just a sense of this lack of good chemistry between what you would know of a normal relationship between advisor and
Yes.
minister.
I mean, when you met Mr. Bobat, there were introductions. I mean, you said, hi,
There were,
I am, well, you say he knew you, Fuzile,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
said, I'm Mr. Bobat. What happened when the two of them met in your presence at that point in time?
Look, I don't recall that they really introduced each other.
And there would be introductions, there would be explanations why people are there in the normal course of business. Holding those variables constant, do you or don't you recall that there was an explanation as between the two of them?
No, I don't recall.
Okay.
Did you say that from what Mr. Bobat said to Mr. Van Rooyen on that occasion, that you could hear and the tone in which he said it, you formed the view that Mr. Bobat seemed to be maybe upset, maybe irritated that Mr. Van Rooyen had not answered his call or returned his call or something like that.
No, I did say that, Chairman, and I stated as a matter of fact.
And what was Mr. Van Rooyen's response to what appeared to you to be a very strange thing, as I see it, that here is an advisor who shows irritation or being upset at the minister, that the minister didn't answer his call? What was his reaction to this?
His reaction was that, look, I didn't recognize that it's you calling, you know, in a way, because he only saw, I would presume this, a number, because if person A calls me and the number is saved against person A, then I see it's A calling, and I take the call. Then I can explain why I couldn't take it if I don't take it. But the explanation cannot be, I didn't know it's you who's calling, because that suggests that he didn't have the number saved. Unless, of course, he called him with a private number, but in which case he would have said it's a private number that I saw. You know.
Yes. Chair, Minister Van Rooyen may or may not testify, and I'd like to test Mr. Fuzile's evidence on this issue, because
if everyone who is seriously implicated will testify, they may decide to come forward themselves, or I will call them.
yes, and that's why I said may or may not, Chair. And but I'd like to, if with your leave, test more on this evidence, if with your permission. You see, Mr. Fuzile, what you indicated already is that when you had the earlier telephonic conversation with Mr. Van Rooyen, it was quite clear to you that he was asserting authority to you. What I want to know
Remember about the notes, Mr. Fuzile. Remember that the notes don't get recorded. Okay, all right.
Yes, that's true. That's correct. Thank you very much for the reminder.
And that stern rebuke was unmistakable, because it led you to conceive that he had some prejudice against officials of Treasury. But here you are with someone who complains to him that he did not answer his call, and you indicate how he responded. What I'm interested in is whether you can recall the mood of his response to Mr. Bobat's complaint that he did not return the call. How was he? How did he comport himself as he was responding?
To be honest with you, he looked a bit sheepish, in a way that is, if I think about it, was getting close to getting under one's skin, because if you think about the story I had been told, and I was thinking about it, that he will arrive with advisors, and there he arrived with one, or he arrived to find the advisor, they're waiting for him. It doesn't make a difference. They were now there, the two of them. And here is a person who has known me for a very long time. We have interacted with each other with a lot of deference and respect, even occasionally calling each other comrade. And now he is going to be my minister. He is going to be my boss in a matter of minutes. I mean, in effect, he was my minister, leave the formality that he just had to be sworn in. And I'm watching him. One level, he puts me down, like I deserve to be put in my place. Fine, he had made that choice on the day. And now here comes this person I was seeing the first time, by the way, who had behaved rather rudely towards me, impolitely. Dare I say, by the way, in front of my subordinates. And now, again, in front of all of us, you have this gentleman, Mr. Bobak, talking to the minister as if the roles have been reversed. It was not...
As if he was the boss to the minister.
Precisely. It just wasn't a nice thing to see.
All right. Now, can I reflect on the conclusion that you draw in paragraph 37? Because it resonates with what Mr. Gondongwana had told you earlier on. You come to the conclusion that there appears an impression that the two did not know each other.
Yes.
On that score.
Yes.
At that moment.
They didn't know each other. They looked to me not to know each other very well.
Very well, yes.
Yeah. So I hope I say it there that they either must have not known each other at all, or they had just gotten to know each other.
Yes. And you remember what Mr. Gondongwana said to you earlier on, and if you don't mind, hold page 62 with one hand and turn back to page 58. Chair, I am at paragraph 18. 18. Yes. And you recall there you said on the previous day, Mr. Gondongwana said to you that your new minister is likely to come with advisors he does not know. I mean, that again is a second real indicator of the nightmarish prediction he laid out before you the previous moment.
I'm sorry, Mr. Maleka, did you say paragraph 18? 18?
18, Chair. Page 58.
I'm sorry. I think. Okay.
Page 58, Chair, you'd recall that the previous night, Mr. Gondongwana, not only did he say there will be a Gupta minister, that minister will arrive with advisors.
They would be of Indian descent.
And they would not be known, in all likelihood, to that minister.
So, so Mr. Fuzile, you must have said, Mr. Gondongwana knew what he was talking about.
I mean, the story is here, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
I have not made.
I mean, he even knew that Mr. Van Rooyen and the advisors that he would have would not be knowing each other, and up to the point that you had the conversation between Mr. Bobat and Mr. Van Rooyen, everything was suggesting that they might not really be knowing each other, at least not well.
Exactly, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And maybe they did not know each other at all. We don't know.
Yes.
Thank you.
Not out of the realm of probabilities.
Yes. And it's a picture of a nightmare which the next day unfolds into a reality. But we will test this with Mr. Gondongwana when he comes in. Mr. Fuzile has given you a broad stroke of the picture. In paragraph 38, you indicate that the ceremony took place, but it was not that long. Of interest to me is what you say about the conduct of Mr. Van Rooyen immediately after the swearing in. I'm now at paragraph 38, page 63. You say that he took out a paper from which there was a statement which he made. Is that a fair summary of what you say in paragraph 38?
Yes, it is.
And then you indicate that that statement did not cover certain topics of concern to you, given the environment of the crisis that was unfolding at the time. Can I ask you to, in broad summary, to just highlight those factors of concern to you which were not covered by the statement?
The first of those is at the heart of the work of the Treasury. You may recall from Minister Gordon, but definitely from what I said yesterday, Mr. Chairman, which was that the biggest job of the Treasury, not to downplay the other functions, they are as important, but the biggest role that the role that the Treasury performs is to produce a budget every year, annual budget. So it is important because it in some senses, it determines the impact, if you will, government has on economic activity in the country, and therefore the prospects for the country. So whenever a budget is to be tabled, the curiosity that South Africans have, investors change. And so that was the speculation that was in the media. And Minister van Rooyen said a couple of what I could call benign things. It's not reckless things, it's not rude things, but in the context where you see the currency is taking a pounding, you see the articles that are written in not only at that time the electronic media, but also the print media, saying that the reason Nene was removed is because he said no to things that would amount to fiscal recklessness. Fiscal policy is going to be loosened. In other words, spending is going to be happening willy-nilly. So there was a need, I would imagine, in fact, not imagine, I thought, to respond directly to that, to say there is going to be policy continuity if you think that it matters, or also come clean and say, I don't care about this thing. These people have been conservative, I'm going to change, and then people deal with you in that context. Similarly, there was speculation that Minister Nene was fired for nuclear. A new Minister of Finance did not have to come and say anything possibly that contradicts cabinet. And we can talk about that in detail if you wish. But he could say something sufficiently carefully worded to allay the fears of the people. So that it's understood that even if there is the commitment to nuclear, but I exist as a Minister of Finance, I'm not about to allow South Africa to commit itself to something it cannot afford. And of course, there had been the issue of fees for higher education that had been kept, which is the reason why the budget allocations could not be finalized. And again, it was in the media and topical at the time. It would have been good for him to say something on it. And ultimately, of course, something got said by Minister Gordon the Monday thereafter, but ultimately in the budget, which was constructive enough without putting him at least in conflict with reasonable people, yes, both in government, his party, and the nation.
Yes. And then you say that the statement he made did not calm the market or the fears of the investors. I'm reading what you say in the unnumbered paragraph following the bullet points. And of course we know that the performance of the Rand on the 10th fell sharper the next day on the 11th compared to its performance between the 9th and the 10th. We don't have to go to those figures.
I confirm that, Mr.
Yes. And then you tell us where we can get the statement issued by Minister van Rooyen. I've looked at it, it's of no moment for the present purposes, unless you want to comment on it. But I don't think that it will help the chairperson one way or the other.
You may not be able to answer this, but answer it if you are able to. What did you ascribe Mr. Van Rooyen's failure in his statement to deal with what you consider to be very important issues that a Minister of Finance should have dealt with on that occasion?
The first problem for me was that he deprived, and I say this with humility, he deprived himself the opportunity to draw on the experience of many people who have been doing the job that he was about to take, and fit your plans and stuff like that. But of course, if you come in at the risk of being verbose, and you have been told that that one and that one and that one, there were 4 of us, are bad, they must go. You can't then get there and listen to them telling you what you must say. Because it's a contradiction, right? And of course, I didn't know that at that time. I was just innocent. I got to know it in the evening from talking to Mr. Jonas. Then I put, connected the dots. So that's the thing. And of course, talking to the people who have been there, who are members of your team, even if you have had good proximity to their work, as Mr. Van Rooyen was, allows you to really understand, because what is said in the media carries a totally different meaning to you. Because they can tell you that when they say this, when the media people are saying this, when investors are asking, or a whole lot of parts of your economy are in pain, figuratively speaking, because of this development. And of course, it may well be that he had this dilemma that the media was not describing him in positive terms. They were using the term backbencher, unknown, and stuff like that. So he just, he may have had those dilemmas too. But if I may say this, and I say it, I mean, it sounds a bit arrogant to say, he hadn't come to terms with the role.
So would you say he might not have had, or he did not have, a true appreciation of the enormity of the issues involved in being Minister of Finance in that kind of environment that had developed since the announcement of the removal of Mr. Nene and his own appointment? Or you would say he did have the appreciation, but he may have had other priorities, as you say?
I think he had a broad sense of appreciating it. But his economic indicators at the end of the news, that would be the time when I switched channels, because I thought this thing had nothing to do with me. And some of this, and one has got to watch how he says it, comes out of the commentary that came from some of the leaders about the rand, which demonstrated lack of appreciation, that it affects everyone. People thought that because it is published as a, you get an index that is in the JSE published, the dollar, rand exchange rate, and my people in the village don't trade currencies. But for heaven's sake, they ride a taxi that has got to have fuel in it, and we don't produce oil, we import it. Yes. So all too quickly, what appears to be a very distant event, an event that I might think should not interest me, doesn't impact me. Yes. So I'm saying that he may have been among those who are on the borderline of not appreciating fully the crisis that was unfolding.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think Minister Gordhan did explain to us the flow-through effect of this weakening rand and its multifold consequences on ordinary people such as you and me, and the inflationary effect of it. I don't want to get there. But you conclude that phase of the swearing-in ceremony by saying to the chairperson that after the swearing-in, Minister Van Rooyen left with the president and did not say anything to you, and you seem to feel affronted by that fact.
Here is time for confession again. This is one of those lines that I put in very last after thinking about it a lot, because I thought that it could be subject to different interpretations, that I was offended personally. Personally, I didn't care about, maybe let me rephrase that. I mean, it's not like I would kill myself for having Mr. Van Rooyen refusing to shake my hand. But I was just concerned that I didn't know who else observed it, who might write about it in ways that suggest that then the relationship between him as the minister and I as DG was not going to work. And the inferences that people would draw from that. Because for some reason, what you find is that in many instances, when people in the media, rating agencies, investors get to know that Mr. X has grown within the Treasury, they've been interacting with him or her, then he becomes a DG, they get to have confidence in the person. A little to do with the shape of his forehead or something like that. It's just they know that this person probably knows what the Treasury is about. So now when he didn't shake my hand, I thought this might have been spotted by the media. And if they did spot this, they will infer that I'm not going to stay.
Okay, I'm sorry. I know I'm interrupting you, but because I didn't hear it well, maybe somebody else also didn't hear it so well. But
actually, he hates me. He doesn't like me. He doesn't want to work with me. And therefore, they will infer that I am likely to leave, and I suspect they wouldn't have been wrong. And of course, they could have inferred that there may be people who also feel that if he doesn't like me, because they've worked with me for long, then they've got no reason to stay with him. And at this time, I didn't know, of course, that he had a list of people. We were having difficulties implementing the legislation that evening. You now understand that he had cause to, there was this kind of industry. I cannot imagine, at the risk of taking this, something we covered yesterday, so problem with it. I think that other fact that he came with this agenda that was given to him by the Guptas. If you take Mr. Jonas's story to be true, which I've got no reason not to believe, if you take that he came with that agenda, it's not inconceivable that he had a real preoccupation to show Mr. Bobat, who
was really quite an unusual thing, because I'm sure in your many years as DG, there would be lots of South Africans who might have been unhappy that whatever it is, it must have been something very important to him that made him do something so unusual. And
one of them is that there has to be a determination by a cabinet relating to the appointment of advisors. We have asked you lawyers, and they have now given us that determination made by a cabinet, set out in the special dispensation, a copy of advisors who could be appointed pursuant to this special dispensation. And perhaps you can identify it for me now, which says that a special advisor cannot assume the functions and duties of a Director General.
In that I said the things he did were illegal because this builds on the Public Service Act,
Yes.
as you were directing. The serving of special advisors on statutory boards or councils for which the executive authority
Of the kind that is approved by Cabinet, that has to be concluded between the special advisor and the executive authority. You see that? And it identifies components of that contract. You would sign that contract.
Yes, I would sign that contract.
As appears,
On a rare
the minister concerned has to prepare and motivate
in this memorandum why it is important, because the Director General of a department, who is the accounting officer, is the person who, as I was describing yesterday, duty and responsibility to make sure that he or...
Now,
Sorry, Mr. Maleka, you said that you people blocked out the names, but whatever you used was not very effective. So I think you must, at the earliest opportunity.
I doubt if you would have a month in which the minister can move with that advisor or leave the advisor.
had you explored that issue at that point in time?
Not when I met Mr. Bobert. And
The one that begins from Friday of the 11th, and you deal with the topic from paragraph 47 on page 67. And I want you to be as quickly as you can in that regard.
into the office, Mr. Jonas was walking out. He looked quite tense. I asked him if he was going to join us, which was just the usual, unless, of course, diaries were not permitting, that the deputy minister, and I would meet together and then meet the executive together. And he shook his head in disagreement and walked towards his office. Of course, I walked into the office, found Mr. Van Rooyen with three gentlemen, Mr. Bobert, that have...
Yeah.
Unless you have other pressing engagements elsewhere.
He walked in, we sat. Could you appoint these two gentlemen?
Possible.
It happened.
And an official
Yeah,
appointment
yeah,
by the President of the U.S.
yes,
in his administration.
yeah.
In fact, some regard that person as a de facto president.
So
But let's not go there.
So I suspect, yes.
Yes.
So I suspect that in just saying the words, Mr. Van Rooyen may have remembered that there are these two roles, advisor and chief of staff. And the one that sounded senior was chief of staff to advisor. And I mean it sincerely because of just chief of staff, advisor, and then he corrected him in that way.
Yes. All right, then we know from your explanation that it is Mr. Bobert who immediately corrected the minister. What did Mr. Ian Whitley say, if ever, he had to say something about the confusion of the roles?
No, he was quiet and smiled a bit.
Was telling you who was going to be chief of staff and who was going to be minister. The two men were he had appointed, isn't it?
That is a reasonable observation, John.
That might be different, and you must just you may comment on this. It might be different if they were not in front of him and he was giving you names. And then maybe if he said, Mr. Bobert, well, as it did said, Mr. Bobert would be chief of staff and Mr. Whitley would be the advisor, he might be having the right face in mind, but the wrong name. But here, they are in front of him. How does one make that mistake?
I would make it, Mr. Chairman, if I'm overwhelmed. When you have got people you don't know very well, you have not known for long, which is why I used the phrase. I don't want to suggest that he doesn't know them very well. And then, but it just looked like the way things were unfolding in front of my eyes, it didn't look like they had known each other for too long. And it also didn't look to me that most of what Mr. Van Rooyen was saying was original, to your point, which is that if you, I even think that, Mr. Chairman, you're being too accommodative. If I know two people very well, and I know two roles that I want to assign them, I don't need to see their faces to say that person A is going to be this and person B is going to be this. If you know the people very well and know the roles very well, you would correct yourself if you have got a Freudian slip.
I'm just trying and understand how it could happen. Maybe there is some explanation, and I'm trying to understand. But you did try to to offer some explanation.
I can see now, Mr. Chairman, you are getting close to where I was. I could sense yesterday that Mr. Maleka was feeling that I should be able to just say that when things were said by Mr. Kodwara, then I should just make sense of these things. The problem with these things is that normal human beings, in my book, operate within a frame of what you expect to be normal. We don't expect that when we're sitting here, someone can just walk in naked, because it is antisocial. It is not how we have been socialized. We understand that before you walk out of your home, you must ready yourself to be presentable. So that is why a lot of what we talk about here, we sound like we have lost our senses, because some of the things just don't make sense, including this next point that if you are happy, I can get into.
Before you get there.
Well, before even Mr. Maleka, you see, part of the reason why I put this to you, I asked this question, Mr. Fuzile, is that part of a judge's job, or anybody who is called upon to listen to evidence from different witnesses and make up his or her mind, is that you always have to leave room that what might seem inexplicable may well be explicable or may well be explained by somebody else. And then when that person explains it, you say, oh, okay, it does make sense. At that time, I didn't see it. So it's part of my job to try and say when something appears to other people not to make sense, or maybe even to me, I try and see if there might be some sense. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And you can see that the training of lawyers is to keep an open mind. Chair, Mr. Van Rooyen and the three persons will speak for themselves. But you, Mr. Fuzile, have to assist us to the extent possible on this issue. And where I was going to test your version on this issue is this. I wanted to do it I wanted to do it after I had explored with you the question of Mr. Mabaso.
Okay.
But let me do it now, because the difficulties the chairperson has put to you are still fresh in your mind. You recall that you have dealt with the question of conflict of or inconsistency of instructions the previous day as between the minister and Mr. Bobert. We've gone through that territory. We don't have to rerun. again. And here you are, second time around. You are now being given something which on the face of it, it's an instruction, repeating or reflecting to some degree that inconsistency. You are asked to facilitate and to do it quickly, the execution of the contracts as the DG for the advisors. You are told by the minister that, hey, for this one, is the chief of staff. On the face of it, and absence any further comment, you would have to do what the minister tells you, correct?
Correct.
Now there's an interruption by someone who corrects the minister. That, by the way, I am the advisor, not the chief of staff. There is conflict at that point in time. At worst, there is an inconsistency. How do you go about implementing that ministerial agent instruction? What line do you take in between, and what line did you intend to take at that point in time?
The problem did solve itself on the spot in a way, or albeit ill-elegantly, because then Mr. Van Rooyen accepted the assignment of roles.
The correction.
The correction, yes, accepted the correction. So because it had come out of his mouth, that's what I was going to explore doing.
Well, here lies the difficulty which I have, and I put it to you so that you can comment on it. It is now Mr. Bobert who reflect the true nature of the instructions, and not the minister.
You are correct.
Well, can we get to Mr. Mabaso, if you have nothing further to say on this second round of a conflict of instructions?
No. Suffice to just make the point that from the difference of views the previous day, and that little bit, but it was clear even from the previous day that we were actually set for a very difficult time as a team, because it was clear that there were times where the advisor and the minister would differ. The advisor is quite assertive, or was quite assertive. Then the minister went on to point in the direction of Mr. Mabaso to say, I shouldn't worry about him insofar as the formalization of the paperwork. He was just going to be around.
What does that mean, or how did you understand him to convey?
I understood him to be saying that we shouldn't have a contract like that sample contract that you saw, Mr. Chairman. One. Two, that then would imply that, in fact, his name wouldn't have appeared on any memorandum like the one that you saw again in the sample. Or if it were to appear, it would have been an odd thing, because we would have said there is going to be someone, but his role is not that clear, and there is no salary, and there isn't going to be a contract. I wouldn't have signed such a...
I guess there would have been no office either.
I don't know about that, because he said he was going to be around. Now, I don't think he was going to be walking up and down passages. But I'm saying it as he said it to me, honestly. So in essence, I understood him to be saying we must not put... Therefore, if you don't have that contract, you cannot capture the person's details on this electronic system that government uses to keep a person's details, to run a person's salary, leave and everything on a regular basis. I objected to that. Actually, very firmly. I said, I don't think it's going to happen. To which Minister Van Rooyen responded in a way that shocked me. In fact, I must say it annoyed me, because he said, no, you must just facilitate this. You are just a DG. Now, at that point, I had to remind him that the role of a DG is, carries more weight than what he was insinuating. In fact, the Director General is the accounting officer of the department. I underline this here. And I found that very disturbing, coming from someone who had been a member of parliament, someone that I had interacted with, who held me accountable. Suggests that when it suits him, he will reduce or diminish this role, which then means he's likely to run roughshod what the responsibilities it carries. Then I could foresee a situation where we were going to disagree every day. And it was at that point that for the first time, I suggested to all of them that they should familiarize themselves with the ministerial handbook and all the relevant laws, so that from that point onwards, we would interact from an understanding of the same rules, of the same system that we were serving. But I also encourage Mr. Van Rooyen to figure out, as he goes through the ministerial handbook, what is allowed in it, and whether there would be a role that he thinks Mr. Mabaso could fit in, which would fit within the rules. But the just being around bit, I said to him, was unacceptable. In fact, I emphasized to him, I said, you may want to think about this before we go to the other meeting with the rest of the colleagues. Part of what concerned me had less to do with me as a person, Lungisa Fuzile, but the role that I was supposed to play. And if I had gone to the meeting with all my reports, where the minister says we've just had a discussion with the DG, we are agreeing that Mr. Mabaso is just going to be around, my colleagues would have thought that from the last time they saw me, I had gone insane.
Well, and that's the sense I get, that you're no longer a Mr. Nice Guy who you were the day before, and now you are setting your own authority of the office of the DG at that point in time. So there has been a swing in the perspective and the conversation between you and the minister at that point in time. Can I just ask you last question before I ask for the lunch adjournment? You indicated when and how you met Mr. Bobat, so that by the time he arrives on the 11th at the Office of Treasury, he's no longer a stranger. What about Mr. Wintley? When did you meet him for the first time?
The occasion in the minister's office was the very first time I ever saw him.
Had you heard about his name before?
Not at all.
What about Mr. Mabaso?
Now, I do not know if I had heard about his name or I checked afterwards, but I checked all of them, by the way, on the internet, just to connect them. And at some point, I picked that Mr. Mabaso may have been a business partner with the Guptas or something like that.
But that's after the fact of your meeting?
I think so. Yes. I think so. I didn't know him before that.
Okay. Chair, I see that it is past 1. I wonder whether it is that moment for a traditional long break.
Yes, we will take the lunch adjournment and we will resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.